You stay and stick it out with your family. The other thing to consider is that Jefferson treated Sally Hemings and her sisters and brothers very differently than he did the other slaves on the mountain. She had seen him let her brothers sort of wander and go off and hire their own time, work for themselves, make keep their own money. The enslaved women on the plantation, all but the Hemingses, had to go to the fields at harvest time. The Hemings sisters did not do that. They were constructed in a different way. And so I might have a different view of Jefferson. I have a particular view of Jefferson from this particular time, and seeing him as, for lack of a better term, an enemy of these people. But it's not clear to me that she would have seen it in exactly the same way that I did. And that's one of the things you have to do when you're writing history is whatever you would want people to do, they may not think about things in the same way. So family and her history with Jefferson, not just the two of them, but his relations with her mother and her brothers and all of these people likely colored the way she considered making this decision.
And of course, she was still a child.
Yes, well, she was, by our light, she's a child. She was 16. The age of consent in Virginia at the time was 10, and they raised it to 12 in the 1820s, and it was that way through the 19th century in most of the states of the Union. So a 16-year-old person to us is like a baby, but a 16-year-old person at that time would not have been thought of as a child.
So once they're back in Monticello, the estate in Virginia, which was Jefferson's home, he went on to father six children with Sally Hemings. But at the same time, he also had a white family that was also a part of his life. How did he navigate having these two separate families under the same roof?
Well, because he was the patriarch of Monticello, and in those days it was much more than father knows best. What he said would go because he was the head of the household. I think it's also important to remember that Jefferson had two surviving daughters with his wife, who died in 1782. So I think he handled it by being the boss, and it was the kind of thing that people would not question. So he had basically the freedom to impose a kind of order on this place that everybody went along with. Plus, you have to remember, I think we have to remember that he wasn't married. And the idea that a man would have a mistress or a companion that he would have a setup like this was normal in Virginia. It was not considered crazy. One of Jefferson's friends said that it was a common practice for widowed or bachelor slave owners to take an enslaved woman as, and he uses the phrase, a substitute for a wife. Obviously, she couldn't be a wife because they couldn't marry. Black people and white people could not get married, well, until 1967 in Virginia. So that was out of the question. But this was something that happened in slavery, and it's hard for us to wrap our minds around, just as it might be hard for us to wrap our minds around about slavery in general. But mixed children, these kinds of connections, from rape to sort of long-term liaisons, however you want to call them, were a part of slave societies, and they have been in every slave society that has ever existed.
When you talk about this familial ties that basically, potentially brought Sally back to Virginia, it's also worth pointing out that Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson in some ways were already related even before they got together in Paris. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, yes. Well, the Hemings children, Robert and James and Sally Hemings, and three other siblings, were the children of a woman named Elizabeth Hemings and a man named John Wales. And John Wales, from whom Jefferson inherited the 135 slaves, and including the Hemings family, was the father of these six children. So Jefferson's wife and Sally Hemings were half sisters. So this connection between the Hemingses and Jeffersons really gets going through Jefferson's wife. Interestingly enough, when John Wales dies and Jefferson and his wife inherit the enslaved people, including the Hemingses. They bring the Hemingses to Monticello, and they are installed as sort of the favored servants of Jefferson and his wife, which is